does the author's use of repetition throughout the poem influence the reader's impression of the return? In this lesson, you will learn how to clarify your impression of the text by analyzing the author's use of repetition. Let's review. We are reading O Captain, My Captain by Walt Whitman. This poem is about a ship returning from a journey and discovering that the captain is dead. We know that as we read, we develop an impression about it. This impression is often shaped by the words the author chooses. As we look at a text, we envision what is happening and determine if those things are good or bad. We also know that an author of poetry is going to choose those words very carefully, since a poem is a much shorter genre than other types of writing. If he or she chooses to use repetition, it must be important. So in this lesson, we are going to reread the text to look at how to clarify our impression of the text by analyzing the author's use of repetition. When we want to clarify our impression of the text by analyzing the author's use of repetition, we can follow these 3 steps. 1. Highlight the repetition. 2. Ask, why did the author choose to repeat these words? And 3. Ask, what impression do these make? So here's my question. How does the author's use of repetition throughout the poem influence the reader's impression of the return? Step 1 in analyzing word choices is to highlight the repetition. Let's start with the first stanza. I'm going to read it and stop anytime I come across some repetition. O Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every wrack, the prize we sought is won. The port is near, the bells I hear, the people all exulting, while follow eyes the steady keel, the vessel grim and daring. But oh heart, 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 there is some repetition. So now I'm going to take out my highlighter and highlight those words. Let's keep going. Oh, the bleeding drops of red, where on the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead. Let's try the next stanza now. O Captain, my Captain, rise up and hear the bells. There's some repetition. I recognize those first words from the first stanza, so I'll highlight those words. Let's keep going. Rise up, for you the flag is flung, for you the bugle trills, for you bouquets and ribbon wreaths, for you the shores a crowding, for you they call, the swaying mass, their eager faces turning. Here, Captain, dear father, this arm beneath your head, it is some dream that on the deck you've fallen cold and dead. There's some repetition again. That last line is the same last line as in the first stanza. Let's highlight those words. Let's go to the third stanza now. My captain does not answer, his lips are pale and still. My father does not feel my arm, he has no pulse nor will. The ship is anchored safe and sound, its voyage closed and done. From fearful trip the victor ship comes in with object won. Exult, O shores, and ring, O bells, but I with mournful tread walk the deck, my captain lies, fallen cold and dead. There's some repetition. Again, I recognize those first words from the first stanza, so I'll highlight those words. Let's keep going. Now that we've highlighted the repetition, it's time to move on to the next step. We need to ask ourselves, why did the author choose to repeat these words? Let's look at what we highlighted. The first time the author used repetition, it was to say, heart, heart, heart. I wonder why. Let's look more closely at that section. I notice that these words come right after he describes a joyful return and right before he reveals that the captain is dead. I also noticed that the word he repeated is heart, which also happens to be a word that we associate with emotion. Think about the phrases, my heart yearns for you, or she broke my heart. Heart is a strong emotional word. I think it signaled me as a reader that something big was about to happen, partly because it was an emotional word. Let's jot that down. Heart, heart, heart is the repetition, and it was a signal to me that something big was about to happen. It's emotional. I also think that repetition shows the death of the captain as a shock to the narrator too. It's almost like he can't catch his breath and is gasping with his words. Heart, heart, heart. I noticed that he also used exclamation points instead of commas, which shows intense emotion and certainly draws attention to that phrase as well. I'm going to add that to my notes too. It shows the captain's death as a shock to the narrator. Let's look at the next use of repetition. The next repetition is when the narrator says, "O Captain, my Captain," at the start of the second stanza. This is exactly the same way he started the first stanza. Since he started the first two stanzas this way, I want to look and see if he did it again in the third stanza. Maybe it's a pattern. But when I look, I see he did not start the last stanza the same way. So again, we want to think, why did the author repeat these words? Well, when the author says, "Oh, captain, my captain," I think he is showing his excitement at their triumphant return. It's kind of like he's celebrating. By the third stanza, the realization that his captain is dead is sinking in, and he's no longer rejoicing. I think for this phrase, "Oh, captain, my captain," it's the lack of repetition in the last stanza that stands out, much more than the original use of it. I think it shows that the mood of the narrator is shifting from excitement to shock to acceptance. So I'm going to jot that down. It's the lack of repetition in the third stanza that stands out, and it shows the mood is shifting from excitement to shock to acceptance. Okay, we have one final phrase to look at. The last use of repetition is the phrase, "fallen cold and dead." When we look, we can see that this same phrase is used to end the other two stanzas as well. So again, let's think, why did the author choose to repeat these words? Having this line repeat at the end of all three consecutive stanzas really shows its importance and emphasis. The fact that the captain has died is a big deal in this poem, and think about it. It's like the more the narrator says it, the more he is pounding it into our heads. This consistent placement and complete repetition of such a morbid detail really makes it stand out as the most important line in the poem. I'm going to write that in my notes. Fallen cold and dead is the repetition, and this is the most important line in the poem. I also think his repeating it over and over shows how the narrator is trying to accept the shock that the captain has died. It's almost like he's trying to remind himself that his captain is gone. He's fallen cold and dead. He's fallen cold and dead. I'm going to write that too. The narrator is trying to accept the shock. So now that I have highlighted the repetition and considered why the author repeated those words, now it's time for my last step. I need to ask myself, what impression do these make? Let's look at our notes. Some of the words that stand out to me are something big, shock, 3 times for that word, mood is shifting, and important line. When I put all of these things together, the impression that I get is that the captain's death was a painful shock that caused the mood to shift from excitement to deep sadness. The repetition, like a hammer, really drives this in for the reader. So back to our question. How does the author's use of repetition throughout the poem influence the reader's impression of the return? The author's repeated words left the impression that the captain's death was a shock. It also caused me to sense a change in the mood of the poem from joyous to mourning. The words heart, heart, heart showed that the death was a painful surprise, and the repeated phrase fallen cold and dead emphasizes the narrator's experience of discovering his dead captain. So let's review the steps we took to clarify our impression of the text by analyzing the author's use of repetition. 1. Highlight the repetition. 2. Ask, why did the author choose to repeat these words? And 3. Ask, what impression do these make? In this lesson, you have learned how to clarify your impression of the text by analyzing the author's use of repetition.